Emile invited my husband's ex to every family event for 3 years, then tried to humiliate me at her anniversary party, and I was done staying silent. My husband, let's call him Colin, and I have been married for 3 years. He's 34, and I'm 31. We dated for 2 years before tying the knot. This is my first marriage, but Colin has been married before. What makes things worse is that his ex-wife is still very much in the picture, all thanks to my mother-in-law, who might as well be Satan's right-hand woman. She despises me, convinced that I stole her son from his perfect first wife. Colin's ex-wife, let's call her Jessica, was his high school sweetheart. She and her family moved in next door when they were teenagers, and since they were constantly around each other, they fell in love. They dated for a few years and eventually went to the same college because the thought of being apart was unbearable to them. After graduation, they got married. The first year was good, until it wasn't. Jessica had decided to be a stay-at-home wife, but Colin had just started working and wasn't making enough to support both of them. Despite this, Jessica insisted on not working because she believed that being a housewife was her calling. But with no kids and a small apartment, there wasn't much to do at home. Colin would tell her that she was wasting both her time and his money, and that she needed to get a job. That's when the fight started. Instead of helping her son navigate his actual issues, my mother-in-law, let's call her Helen, made things worse. She convinced Jessica that having a baby would magically fix their marriage. And of course, Jessica took the bait. She started pushing Colin to have a child, convinced that it would bring back their happiness. Colin, however, was not on board. He was barely keeping up with their current expenses, and a baby would only add to the financial strain. Plus, he was still young, not even 25. He wasn't emotionally or mentally ready for that responsibility. But once Helen planted that idea in Jessica's head, there was no changing her mind. She became obsessed with the idea and started accusing Colin of not loving her enough to start a family with her. Their fights escalated, and eventually, after one particularly bad argument, Colin hit his breaking point. One day, after a full week of constant fighting, he decided he couldn't do it anymore. Divorce was the only way out. And that's when the real drama began. Helen took Jessica's side completely, spreading rumors that Colin had been having an affair and that's why he wanted out. The most hurtful part? Most of these accusations came from his own mother. Eventually, things calmed down. Colin and Jessica stayed civil. Jessica even softened after the divorce was officially filed, crying, promising to change, swearing she'd be a better wife if he gave her another chance. But Colin was done. He wanted a real shot at being happy. Jessica moved back in with her parents, while Colin stayed in his apartment. But even though he was ready to move on, Helen wasn't. If anything, she and Jessica became even closer after the divorce. Since they lived nearby, they saw each other constantly. Meanwhile, Colin focused on himself. He worked hard, and eventually, he landed a job at the company I worked for. By the time I met him, he had already been divorced for a couple of years. I first saw Colin on his first day at work, about 2.5 years ago. He sat at the desk opposite mine. At first, we weren't even friends. But one day, he struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we became really close. Then, he asked me out, and I said yes. We quickly became inseparable, and for the first year, everything was smooth. I always knew that Colin's mother was never going to like me. He had warned me that she had unresolved issues and had always treated Jessica better than she treated him, which was insane, considering he was her biological son, and Jessica was just her daughter-in-law. He had told me everything about his first marriage and how it fell apart, and I felt bad for him. Even before meeting his mother, I had already prepared myself mentally. I knew she wouldn't like me. Apparently, she was still holding on to the hope that Colin would go back to Jessica, and in her mind, I was the only thing standing in the way of that. So, I had zero expectations when I first met his family. His father and sister were relatively nice, but just as I expected, Helen was cold. She didn't even try to hide how much she disapproved of our relationship. Colin had taken his time introducing me to his family. We had already been together for almost 10 months before I met them. His mother had known about me long before that, but when she finally met me in person, she made it very clear that I would never be welcome in the family. Honestly, I didn't care. As long as Colin was on my side, Helen's opinion didn't matter to me, especially knowing how strangely attached she was to her ex-daughter-in-law. I figured I'd rather have her hate me than end up as the next Jessica. I already knew about Colin's first marriage and how his mother had always favored Jessica. I thought I had prepared myself for everything, but I was not prepared to see Helen and Jessica actually team up against me. After Colin first introduced me to his family and brought me to their home, Helen made sure Jessica was invited to every single family event I attended. Her excuse? That Jessica was part of the family. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted to get into my head, to push me to my breaking point, waiting for me to snap and throw a fit over Jessica being there. But what they didn't know was that I had already expected something like this. As long as they weren't actively standing in my way, I didn't care. I knew they were playing mind games, and I wanted them to see that I wasn't someone they could intimidate. So, for the years that I was dating Colin, Jessica was always there at family gatherings. But Colin and I ignored her completely. We'd even laugh about it when we got home, knowing full well that this was not the reaction they were expecting. This continued even after we got married. And neither Helen nor Jessica ever had the courage to actually say anything to my face. They would just hover in the background, glaring and whispering to each other. Furious that we weren't playing into their little games, Colin and I eventually got engaged, and everything was still fine between us. The real problem started after we got married. Of course, Jessica wasn't invited to our engagement party or the wedding. Helen wasn't in charge of the guest list. But after we got married, most holidays and family events were held at Helen's house. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries, you name it. And Jessica? She was always invited. At first, she and Helen stuck to their usual routine, glaring at me from across the room, making their little passive-aggressive comments under their breath. But after the wedding, they started actively picking on me. It started off small, just a few remarks. A couple of backhanded compliments about my outfit or my makeup, followed by giggles like they were still in high school. That was easy to ignore. I didn't care if they hated the way I dressed or how I did my makeup. Their opinions meant nothing to me. But then, they got bolder. They started insulting me outright. They'd make snide remarks, implying that Colin had made a mistake by marrying me. Saying things like, "Poor Colin, now he has to get used to doing all the household chores by himself since his wife will never have the time." Why? Because I had been promoted over Colin a couple of months ago. They wanted to emasculate him. They wanted to make it seem like I was the one wearing the pants in the relationship, as if that was some kind of insult. It was pathetic. It was old-fashioned. And it was exhausting. But honestly, I didn't expect anything better from them. They would say things like Colin had screwed up by letting go of Jessica because, at the very least, she would have made sure they had a family by now. And, according to them, I would never be able to give him that, because apparently, I was already too old to have kids. Which is absolutely ridiculous. I've heard of plenty of women who have successfully had children after 30, even after 35. They would bully me over the strangest things, and even though I tried my best to brush it off, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore them. It wasn't just about mocking my appearance anymore. They started attacking things that were completely out of my control, like the fact that I had been promoted over Colin. They even insulted the way I was raised, saying I didn't know how to be a good wife, and that Colin had really lost when he let Jessica go. And the worst part? They said all of this right to my face. And Colin? He never said a word. Before we got married, when Helen would invite Jessica to family events, it never really bothered me because they never actually said anything to me. I knew that whatever game they were playing, we were winning. But after the wedding, things changed. At first, I still managed to brush it off. But after a certain point, it became too much. I had reached my breaking point. So last year, after Christmas dinner at Helen's house, I decided to finally talk to Colin about his mother's behavior. I knew Jessica's actions were out of his control, so I didn't even bring her up. I didn't blame him for her. But the one thing he could control was his mother. He could have talked to her, told her that he didn't appreciate the way she and Jessica were treating me. I knew that cutting Helen off wasn't an option. Doing so would mean Colin wouldn't be able to see his father anymore. And his dad, unlike his mother, was a good man. But due to unfortunate circumstances, he was wheelchair-bound and fully dependent on Helen's care. We had even offered to move him in with us a couple of times, but he had refused. And honestly, I understood. Helen might not have been a great mother, but she was a good wife. So cutting her out of our lives wasn't on the table. All I wanted was for Colin to promise me that he would talk to her, that he would tell her to lay off. That Christmas, Helen and Jessica had been especially cruel. They were at their absolute worst. They made comments about how our marriage was doomed to fail and kept making disgusting little jokes about how I'd better hold on to Colin if I didn't want him to go back to Jessica. It made everyone at the table uncomfortable, and it infuriated me. That night, I decided I had to talk to Colin and tell him to put an end to this. I could have confronted Helen and Jessica myself, but my entire life, I've been told that I have a tendency to take things too far. I didn't want to say something that would ruin Colin's relationship with his mother, because that would also ruin his relationship with his father. And I did not want to be responsible for that. That's why, up until that point, I had kept my cool. I had never dignified their jabs with a response. But that night, I had enough. Somebody needed to put an end to this. I expected Colin to stand up for me, to say something. When he didn't do it on his own, I thought maybe he just needed a nudge in the right direction. But when I sat him down to talk about it, he didn't even try to entertain the discussion. He flat out told me that he wasn't interested in getting caught up in family drama. And to be completely honest, I didn't even see this as family drama, or drama at all. This was real. This was affecting me. They were insulting me. And as my husband, he should have at least tried to intervene. I shouldn't have even had to ask him. Instead, he turned it back on me. He said that he had always thought I was an independent woman, and that he believed I was capable of fighting my own battles, which is why he had nothing to say. I thought that was incredibly condescending. I told him that I had no problem standing up for myself, but if I did, it could very well ruin his relationship with his mother. And if that happened, he would never get to see his dad again. His response? He told me I could just choose not to attend these family gatherings. But that wasn't an option either. I didn't want to come off as a coward. So I told him that the next time Jessica and Helen picked on me, I would hit back. But then, as an afterthought, Colin told me not to do that, probably because he was scared that if I took things too far, his mother would cut him off, and he wouldn't be allowed to see his dad. Yet, despite all that, he still insisted that this was just family drama, and refused to get involved. I had put up with Helen and Jessica's behavior for months. I had stayed quiet for so long, but I wasn't willing to do it anymore. After a lot of arguing and shouting, we finally came to a compromise. I would sit out the next few family gatherings. Colin would cover for me, making excuses, maybe saying I was too busy to attend. Of course, that would only fuel their hatred and give them more to talk about. But that was a risk I was willing to take. And so, for the past couple of months, I haven't attended a single family event. And honestly, it's been great. Colin and I never really had any problems aside from this whole situation with his mother. And since I wasn't attending any gatherings, we had pretty much forgotten about all of it. But then, a couple of weeks ago, Colin came home and told me that his parents were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary, and they had specifically asked for me to be there. Apparently, if I didn't show up to such an important event, it would reflect poorly on the family. Helen was even willing to speak to me in person if that's what it took to convince me to attend. I was a little surprised that they wanted me there, but I decided to go anyway. If they were finally trying to make things right, I was willing to give them a chance. And the fact that Helen had personally requested for me to attend seemed like a nice gesture. I'm the kind of person who likes to see the good in people, so this didn't set off any alarms for me. So, I told Colin I would go with him. When Colin confirmed it, Helen even reached out to me via text to thank me for agreeing to attend. I thought that was really sweet, and I actually believed that maybe things were finally going to change for the better. Of course, they didn't. I was a fool for even thinking that. A few days ago, I attended the anniversary party with Colin. A lot of people had been invited. His entire family was there, along with some of his friends, and, unsurprisingly, Jessica was there too. Helen and Jessica were exceptionally nice to me. They welcomed me to the party with big smiles and warm greetings. For a while, everything seemed fine. Colin and I were socializing, talking to different people. We had been there for about an hour when, at one point, we were speaking to one of his aunts. And then, out of nowhere, Helen and Jessica joined the conversation. I didn't have a problem with it, at first. But then, for absolutely no reason, Helen started talking about how she wished that everyone could have a love story like hers and her husband's. She went on about how they had been childhood sweethearts, growing up as neighbors, how they got married as soon as they were legally old enough. At first, I thought it was a sweet story, until she suddenly shifted gears and started talking about how she had wished the same thing for her son. She said she had almost believed it would happen when he married Jessica. I was completely taken aback by that statement. One moment, she was reminiscing about her own love story, and then, out of nowhere, she blindsided me with that. That's when I realized that this had all been an act. Her real intention had been to humiliate me. When she started talking about how she and her husband met, everyone had stopped to listen, just like me. We had all assumed it was going to be a sweet little anecdote in honor of their anniversary. But of course, no. She had to make it about her favorite girl, Jessica. She didn't even look at me when she said how much she wished Colin had stuck it out with Jessica instead of leaving her and getting a divorce when things got tough. And then Jessica, of course, jumped in. She said she was still willing to work things out with him, that she knew I was just a rebound, and that he was actually still in love with her. Colin looked just as blindsided as I felt, and I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed at them to back off because they were literally insane if they thought I was going to put up with this. I called them a bunch of spineless cowards and told them I was done tolerating their psychotic behavior. I looked straight at Helen and told her she was crazy and needed to get herself checked. It was very obvious to me that she had deep-seated mental issues and should be committed to an institution because, in my opinion, she was beyond help. And if she loved Jessica that much, she should have just adopted her. As for Jessica, I told her she was the most pathetic and vile creature I had ever had the misfortune of coming across. And honestly, I should have just stopped there, but I didn't. I turned to my father-in-law and told him that I respected him and truly appreciated that he didn't treat me the way his wife did. But I also told him he should really think about who he had been married to all these years. Because even though Helen took care of him, she was still a monster. Then, I stormed out of the party. I didn't even care if Colin was following me. I didn't look back. At that moment, I only cared about myself and getting the hell out of there. Shockingly enough, he didn't come home with me. I had to take a cab alone. He only came back half an hour after I got home. And when I confronted him, demanding to know what the hell he had been doing for so long, he snapped at me. He said he was cleaning up the mess I made. He told me he had to apologize, not just to his parents, but to all the guests, because of my outburst. He said I had taken things way too far, and that I owed everyone a huge apology as well. According to him, the way I behaved was unacceptable, that the things I said were insane, and, apparently, I should have just saved it for another day, instead of ruining their anniversary party and having a meltdown in front of so many people. I thought it was ridiculous of him to pin the blame on me when this entire mess could have been avoided if he had just had the courage to confront his mother and tell her to shut up. Instead, he had allowed Helen and Jessica to gang up on me and bully me for 3 years. And all because he didn't want to get involved in family drama. Even if my dignity was at stake, I thought it was completely unfair. And honestly, it hurt more than I expected. I told him he was being an inconsiderate husband, and that's when the argument spiraled out of control. We haven't exchanged a word in the past few days, and the silence has been unbearable. I don't feel like I owe anyone an apology, but I can't deny that the whole situation has left me feeling drained. Because, aside from the ongoing tension with his family, Colin and I have always been solid. I love him, and I know he loves me, but when it comes to standing up to his mother, he shuts down. Mostly because of his father. I want to make things right between us, but apologizing feels wrong. Yes, maybe I let my emotions get the best of me, but after everything, it was bound to happen. Helen and Jessica have spent years undermining me, and I finally snapped. I refuse to believe I was in the wrong. I doubt most people in my shoes would have shown as much restraint as I did. That being said, I need to know. AITA for standing up for myself and calling out my mother-in-law, father-in-law, and my husband's ex-wife in front of his entire family at their anniversary party? Update 1. I know some people might not agree with this, but honestly, I don't care. All I wanted was to fix my marriage. Instead of letting resentment build up, I decided to talk to Colin, because despite everything, I didn't want to lose him. I didn't apologize. But last night, after we got home from work, I told him I needed to talk. To my surprise, he didn't even say a word. He just walked over and hugged me. And that hug lasted for almost 5 minutes. Then, before I could even speak, he apologized to me. He told me he had missed me, that he knew he had been a fool, and that he had let embarrassment get the better of him that night instead of standing by me like he should have. Then, he told me something I never expected. After our fight, he had been sleeping on the couch. One night, he called Helen, and finally put his foot down. He told me he had decided to cut ties with his family, including his father, because, on the night of the party, his father had sided with Helen without a second thought. So, as far as Colin was concerned, that was it. It was just us now. I can't even explain the relief I felt in that moment. I thought I was going to have to fight for this, to argue, to justify my feelings. But instead, Colin made it so much easier than I ever expected. I'm beyond grateful to have a man like him by my side. We both agreed to start marriage counseling, because we don't want to let things fester again and explode in unhealthy ways. So, thank you to everyone who gave advice. I appreciate it more than I can say. And most of all, I'm relieved that Colin and I are on the same page again. Update 2. Hey everyone. Just checking in to say that marriage counseling has been going really well. It's been a couple of months now, and we've had zero contact with his family. It was tough for Colin at first, but in the end, he realized just how toxic they had been. And every day, we're growing stronger. Update 3. It's been a while, but I'm back with amazing news. Colin and I are expecting a baby. I'm only a few weeks along, and honestly, it still doesn't feel real. We haven't told anyone yet. We're keeping it quiet for now because I know that if Colin's family finds out, they'll push to reestablish contact. And right now, we just want peace before we have to deal with that inevitable mess. But in this moment, it's just me, Colin, and our baby. And I have never been happier in my entire life. I'm so glad I fought for this. It may not be the right choice for everyone, but for me, it was the best decision I ever made. Helen and Jessica completely sabotaged themselves with this one. Because Colin is, without a doubt, the best man I have ever known. and I wouldn't trade this life with him for anything.